My baby dolls, we're back again with another episode of Genesis. We got a great show for you in store today. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today we are talking about more classic baseball. We are going to be talking about Walter Johnson, baseball's big train. And you know what's interesting, and I'll tell you what's very interesting about this. His grandson, Henry W. Thomas, wrote the definitive biography about 20 years ago, maybe 21 years ago. I think it was copyrighted in 1995. And he's going to be here today to talk about his grandfather and how he got interested in writing such a book. And I'll tell you this much. You know, the reviews of all of this book are just so incredible, and so many people say this book should be on your shelf. And for anyone interested in classic baseball, especially the dead ball era, but by which most of you know who know me, I have the Ty Cobb and the dead ball era sites. This book should be on the shelf because it is an unbiased account, and we're going to ask Henry, and when he comes on the show, how he was able to remain impartial when writing about his grandfather. And it is a fantastic book. As always, you are listening to the Comfortably Zone Radio Network. Again, this is Ralph Tycho's baby. He's the Zigzag Man, and I know that he had Hank Thomas on his show a little bit back, but today we're going to be talking Walter Johnson, and 1907 is a lot different than 2017, and I hope you folks are enjoying the new baseball season. A couple of surprises, including my Yankees, and unfortunately, living up in Red Sox territory, you get a mouthful about it. But I'll tell you one thing. It sickened me the other night to watch racial slurs being, shouted at Adam Jones on Baltimore, and the Fenway favorites apologized, the management apologized, and I just believe that in 2017 the game is different than, say, the time that Walter Johnson pitched, obviously, but different than 1947 when Jackie Robinson had to endure this. This should not occur today in 2017, but unfortunately it does. Old habits are hard to die off, I guess, and that's all I have to say about that. But Walter Johnson, for those of you who do not know who Walter Johnson was, we're going to ask Hank today, was he the greatest pitcher ever? And in my opinion, yes. And I'm going to read, to introduce Walter Johnson, then we'll bring on Hank, from the Society of American Baseball Research. Their starting paragraph on Walter Johnson pretty much sums up who Johnson was. And for those of you who will get interested in Johnson, again, go out and get Hank's book. It's still on Amazon. Still a great read, and we'll also ask Hank if any new information surfaced in 20 years since writing the book. But, here we go. On August 2nd, 1907, a young man later described by Frank Graham as beyond doubt the greatest pitcher that ever scuffed a rubber with his spikes, made his big league debut for the Washington Senators, losing a 3-2 decision to the pennant-bound Detroit Tigers. The great Ty Cobb admitted that Johnson's fastball made me flinch and hissed with danger. By the time he hung up his spikes 20 years later, Walter Johnson had recorded statistics which seemed beyond belief: 417 wins, 279 losses, 3,509 strikeouts, 110 shutouts, 12 20-win seasons, 11 seasons with an earned run average below 2.00, and what seems almost incomprehensible a century later, 531 complete games in 666 starts. Now, how do you like that number, 666? Anyway, but as superlative as his pitching record was, Shirley Povich, who did the foreword in Hank's book, also said about Johnson, Walter Johnson, more than any other ball player, probably was the symbol of gentlemanly conduct in the heat of battle. And I think that paragraph sums up Walter Johnson's career and why it should be studied just from the statistics alone. But as we're going to learn, he was a true gentleman on the field and off. And without any further ado, welcome to the show, Henry Thomas.
Thanks, Ian. Great to be here.
I hope
talking my favorite subject, as I told
right.
you before. Yeah.
That's right, Walter Johnson, the
Terrific.
big trend. Now let me ask you something. You were born in 46. Your grandfather died, I think, that December, if I'm not mistaken, from the malignant tumor that pretty much paralyzed most of his body. He was 59. Why did it take so many years to write such a great biography of him?
Well, mostly because the era of what I call adult biographies of American sports stars didn't start until the 70s, really. And I kind of look at Robert Kramer's biography of Babe Ruth as, which I think came out in 74, as the first that I was aware of. The first book that I can remember that I thought of, and before that, I mean, don't get me wrong, there was lots of biographies. There was a biography of Johnson that came out shortly after he died. He died in December of 46. I was 8 months old at the time, and a biography came out in 1948, Walter Johnson, King of the Pitchers by Roger Treat. And I loved that book as a kid. I mean, I read it a dozen times, and it really it captures the feeling of Johnson's career and personality very, very well. And I love that book. And I don't mean to denigrate it or other books of that era, but they've been described as sort of gee whiz biographies or gee whiz histories, in that they don't, they're not looking for both sides of the story. I mean, certainly many books had been written about Babe Ruth, and several about Ty Cobb and other players, and it was sort of, isn't this great? They were for kids, really, or youth. You don't want 12-year-olds reading about Babe Ruth's nighttime escapades. You want the positive part of it. Ruth was a great guy and beloved by children and adults alike. He really was just a wonderful, friendly, happy guy, and so you could leave the rest of it out, but I mean, gosh, there was censorship in movies and books, magazines of all types during that time, and you sort of there was the adult part of the conversation was deemed unfit for exposure to children, and rightly so from a certain standpoint. So, but the times change, and in the 70s, the first book I can remember that sort of struck me as wow. I mean, this is the unvarnished truth here was The Glory of Their Times, which came out in 1966, was based on interviews that Lawrence Ritter did with old-time ball players, and that laid out what these guys really thought about things at the time. And then shortly thereafter, you had adult biographies of old sports greats starting to come out. So it wasn't. It was just a sign of the times that there hadn't been a full-fledged, there hadn't been full-fledged biographies of really anybody up to that time. and I kept waiting for someone more qualified than myself. I mean, I didn't have it in mind until very late in what for many years was just a hobby for me, looking into exploring my grandfather's life and career, and it was a hobby. It was just one of those things that the more I looked into it, the more interesting it became to me, and the more I wanted to know, and I just kept getting deeper and deeper, and at some point I started taking notes just because I was spending a lot of time at the Library of Congress and other research facilities and digging up some pretty cool stuff. And I thought, well, I should at least, maybe this will be useful to somebody else. I never had it in mind that, I wasn't a professional writer of any kind. I was running nightclubs most of the time, so as a career or as jobs. Anyway, that's sort of the story. And I kept waiting for someone else, maybe Kramer or Charles Alexander, who did a good biography of Cobb, the first, really good biography, and others started coming out, and I thought, well, certainly they're going to, somebody's going to do Walter one of these days. And it just, for whatever reason, it didn't happen, and I found myself at a point where I had some time and I had some money and I had all these research notes, and I thought, well, you know what? Let me give it a shot, and that's all it was. And I was fully expecting that I'd get into it and find myself over my head. I wasn't going to do a biography of my grandfather just to do it, and if I wasn't happy with it, then I wasn't going to. But I again, like the notes, I thought, well, maybe I can carry it a bit forward to where a professional will want to pick it up and use what I'd done to that point, mostly in terms of the research. And I just kept going, and I'd show pieces of it to friends, and they'd say, "This is great. Keep going. I want to read more." So I got a lot of encouragement. Mom was very encouraging. She thought it was fantastic what I was doing, and just was always telling me, don't sell yourself short. You're doing a good job. Keep it going. So that's what happened.
Now, in your book, and it's very interesting, because you mentioned in your book that, first of all, your grandmother, Hazel, died in 1930. What was she, 36 years old, 35 years old or something?
Yeah,
like that?
Tragic. That was the great tragedy of his life.
And, he had a huge setback after that. We'll get into that after. But, Walter died and you were 8 months old. But you found your interest, like we spoke before you came onto the show, that you found it like at meetings locked away in this cabinet, in this box. And the more you looked into it, the more you got interested. And in fact, Walter and Hazel were so far removed from you, they were just like almost, ghosts or something that, people speak of, but you never really saw. But let me ask you this question. Didn't your mom speak of your granddad and all this stuff to first pique your interest before you actually started diving into the material yourself?
No, I really don't remember that. And now she was born in 1923, so he retired as a pitcher in 27, and then he retired from baseball altogether in 1935. So she was only 12 years old. So she really doesn't remember much about his baseball career. Her memories are mostly of being at the ballpark when he was the manager and how nice all the other players were. And of course they're going to be nice to Walter Johnson's daughter. They loved him, and a lot of them had played with him that he managed. So her memories are mostly of him as just a dad and as a farmer. He bought a big farm out in Germantown, Maryland, just outside of D.C. when he retired, and I'm sure maybe she mentioned him from time to time, but as I told you before the show, he amazing. He was like pictures on the wall to me until I got old enough to be going to Griffith Stadium, and they had the memorial there, and there was always a page or two in the yearbook about Walter Johnson, the greatest of all Senators players ever, and so I was proud of that. I thought it was very cool, and my friends thought it was very, it was very cool that I was Walter Johnson's grandson. But for Mom, no, she just took it for granted that he was just Dad to her.
And let me ask you this question: when you did your research, and like I mentioned to start the show, when you did your research, I'm going to ask two questions. Number one, how long did it take you to do the research? Because you traveled everywhere here, as you wrote in your book. And two, how were you able to stay unbiased in your account of your grandfather?
Well, the first question, how long did it take? It's hard to say because it was over. I started with, and you know this story, you made reference to it. The whole thing started, I was in my early 30s, and I don't remember the exact occasion, but it was one of those where I was at Mom's house, at my parents' house, and my dad died in '79, so I think this was probably a year or two before that. And it may have been a Thanksgiving, and everybody, you're sitting around, you're stuffed with food, and you're sitting around watching a football game or something. And there was some occasion where I was looking for something to do, and I was kind of bored. That much I remember. I don't remember the exact occasion, but we had the scrapbooks, voluminous scrapbooks. There was about 30 of them, and they were huge. Old style, 20s style scrapbooks with page after page of newspaper clippings that my grandmother had assembled during his career. And I pulled one out. We had them in these cabinets in the living room of our house in Chevy Chase and D.C., and I don't ever remember. I don't think I ever did that when I was a kid. Now I'm like 31 or 32, and on this occasion, for some reason, I just reached into the cabinet. I opened the cabinet and pulled out a scrapbook and started reading. And maybe it was just a good scrapbook to start with. Maybe it was one from 24 or 25 or something, but I was blown away. I never realized until then. I knew he was one of the great pitchers of all time, but I never knew just that he was considered not just one of the greats, but really during his career. He was it. People would talk about pitchers like Matheson and Cy Young in the same breath, but it was always in reference to, they were the greatest pitchers until Walter Johnson came along. And then after Walter, he really was the king of the pitchers, so to speak, during his time and even afterwards. And so that's what the scrapbooks really demonstrated pretty much conclusively. And also there was lots of articles about him as a man. That was a big story in his time. The ball players were they were made into archetypes. Babe Ruth, the happy, friendly, smiling guy, Ty Cobb, the snarling, aggressive, win at all costs stereotype, and Lou Gehrig, the tragic figure. And Walter's stereotype, archetype was the nice guy, the friendly personality, the sweet personality, and they kind of put together the two because his weapon was the fastball. And that's basically all he threw for most of his career was fastballs. And there's no doubt in my mind that he threw the fastest ball of all time because that's all he had. And every other fastball pitcher that I'm aware of, had for some reason, and maybe it's just that they could throw so hard, they could put so much on the ball, but they all had a devastating out pitch. I mean, Bob Feller had one of the greatest curveballs of all time to go with his fastball. Nolan Ryan had that fast, that sharp breaking curve. Clemens, with a great slider. Carlton with that sweeping curve. Koufax had one of the great curveballs of all time. So I don't know why that works, but it certainly made them more effective. They're fast. It really set up their. I mean, major league pitchers can hit any fastball, really, if they know it's coming. If they think it's coming, they can sit on it. They're good enough. They're fast enough to hit anybody's fastball. Well, they couldn't hit Walter's fastball. They just didn't. And the players talked about it a lot. I mean, it was, and they said, you knew it was coming. You knew he was throwing a fastball, and you knew it was going to be over the plate because he had such great control. And you still couldn't hit it. That's how great Walter was. That's what they would say in these articles. And so pretty quickly, I was just grabbed by both sides of the story. What a great pitcher he was, and also just what a wonderful human being the players all said he was, and they said what a good thing that was, because most pitchers would throw at hitters in those days. Well, they still do, and Walter wouldn't, and that came up a lot in reading about him. You didn't have to dig very far to see how grateful the players of his era were that he didn't throw at hitters. He wouldn't. He was afraid that he'd kill somebody with that fastball. And so they knew the ball was that they weren't, so they could dig in at the plate, and they still couldn't hit him. You look at his numbers. Look at what he did with these terrible Washington teams that, didn't have any hitting most of the time. And you put all that together, and you he was special. Walter was special.
And I was watching the other day to prepare for the show footages of Walter Johnson, and two things I want to mention as well before I even get to it. How did you remain unbiased in your account of your grandfather? If you were going to write this biography, you'd have to, like you mentioned, you'd have to give a complete overview of not only the good but the bad. And when a lot of authors have been criticized of supporting and this, but your biography, everyone said you wrote it like you weren't even a relative. You wrote it like you were just a historian, just laying out the story.
Well, I really appreciate your saying that, and I've always there's two things that really perk me up and make me happy when I'm reading or listening or somebody's talking about my book. I mean, obviously nobody knows that book and everything about it better than myself. So, there's very little you could say that, people, I appreciate it when people say, oh gosh, I really enjoyed it. It's a great book. Any compliments, of course. But I know the book. I know its strengths and its weaknesses by now and all like that. But there's two things. One is what you just said, that it seems like it's like an unbiased account. And because I tried very hard, I knew going in, people are going to say, oh gosh, it's his grandson. What do you expect? It's going to be all the sunshine and light and none of the darkness and that kind of thing. And the other thing is when people say that it was well written. I mean, I really enjoy that because I also worked very hard at that, and that's something. I don't know. It just turned out. I didn't know before that. It just turned out that and I've written a lot since that I don't know. That skill, whatever it is, that combination of skills, turns out well, Shirley Povich told me that, he thinks writers are born. They're not made. It's something you can't learn to write well or probably speak well, really. I mean, you can practice to some extent, but Povich, he was very much of the opinion that writers are born and not made. And so, I mean, look, I was lucky in one sense in that there wasn't a lot. I mean, if there was a dark side to Walter, if there was a bad side, if there really was, some hidden side that the writers, didn't want to talk about, like there was with, a lot of other sports figures of the time. That side it was there for one other reason. They were mean or they were just wild or whatever. I mean, that didn't get talked about. If there's a side of Walter like that, I could find no evidence of it. I mean, none. And I've had some funny people have asked me, well, what's the let's see, what's the worst incident that you can that you found in your research that you came up with? What's the worst thing he ever did? And I'd come up with something that was almost comical. I'd have to remember, like when I interviewed my Uncle Ed, I asked him that question. I said, Walter had this, he just had this wonderful personality. I mean, everybody talks about what a great guy he was and how friendly he was and how modest and just, people said this a lot. They wondered if Walter was aware of his stature in the game, because when you were around him, there was no indication of that he thought, that he had done anything particularly special in his career, or thought that he himself was anything really, to write home about. And anyway, Ed, I said, so I'd asked my uncle, I said, did you ever see him get angry? And Ed, I mean, Uncle Ed's thinking, and he comes up and he says, well, boy, he says, I can think of one time we were milking the cows, and a cow, Walter had, Dad had almost had a full bucket, and a cow, something got into them, and they kicked out with their leg and then knocked it over. And here's this milk all over the floor, this bucket full of milk that Walter's just made. And he says, Dad stood up, and you could see how mad he was, and he said, goodness gracious. That was Walter's curse. Goodness gracious. And he says, yeah. He says, that's really the only time I ever saw Dad get angry. So, so finding, getting back to the point of, it wasn't, I mean, and I almost I relished incidents. There was a time he almost got into a fist fight with Jack Dunn when they were opposing managers in the International League, and there was something that, I don't know what it was. There was something that, there was a tough game, and the two managers, Johnson and Dunn, met on the way to the locker rooms or something, and Dunn said something to Johnson, and a reporter was there, and Johnson said something back, and the reporter said that he said something like, well, you got no business to talk like that or something, and the reporter said it looked for a second there like there was going to be fisticuffs between these two managers. Now, I can't imagine anybody, I'm sure Dunn, Walter was just a big, strong guy. I can't imagine anybody wanting to get into a fight with him. But, I mentioned that in my book. I thought that was pretty, okay, there's something, and writing about his managerial career, it was mixed. I think he did pretty well, actually. I think he was a good manager, not a great manager. He was okay, and but managers are hired to be fired, and they always get fired. And even Clark Griffith, who loved Walter like a son, fired him from Washington after actually some very good seasons, but they couldn't win a pennant. And Griffith finally, he's like, okay, well, we need a change, and so he fired Walter. And the reporters felt free at that point to weigh in on what they thought of Johnson as a manager, and I put that in there. Some of them thought, he was just too easygoing, too nice a guy, didn't control his team well enough, or nitpicking about the strategy of bringing in relief pitchers. That he didn't believe in relief pitchers because he never needed one himself. And that may be a fair, that might be a fair criticism. I mean, that's a classic story of managers. Is that a lot of the, very few of the great ball players ever made any decent managers, and people, a theory is that, well, they just expected ball players to be as good as they were, and you can't, that's an unrealistic expectation. So I tried. I mean, when there was something negative about Walter, I didn't hesitate. I don't know that I enjoyed it particularly, but at least it gave some counterpoint to the I didn't want it to appear to be, oh, this is the Pollyanna side of the story. I wanted it to be the whole thing.
And it certainly, the results were definitely to show for it, because you would never know that you're, his grandson by reading this account. Now, let me ask you this question. In watching the films, getting back to what I was telling you about 5 minutes before, watching the films, I saw that Johnson threw sidearm. And not only that, but again, let's take the listener here and see what kind of ball he was throwing back then. It wasn't the clear white balls you get every time the ball goes into the dirt. Back then you could spit on it. The spitball wasn't outlawed until 1920. I think Burley Grimes, who pitched for Brooklyn, was the only one who was grandfathered who could use it past that season when Landis came in as commissioner. But,
No, there was a bunch of them that were grandfathered. There was actually quite a few. Grimes was the last. He went until I think 1934 was his last year. So he was the last survivor of the spitball pitchers, the legal guys.
Now,
but there was a bunch of them.
Now Johnson threw fastballs. In your research, did you see that he threw it in the dirt, spit on it, anything, to get, because it wouldn't move at a fastball. It wasn't like you spit on it and it moves different when he's throwing fastballs.
Well, actually, it was exactly the opposite with him of what most pitchers. Pitchers love to mess with the baseball because, as you say, it's going to make it move. And many pitchers learned to not just the spitball, but they had they would scuff the ball with their belt buckles. They would put coffee grinds in the seams, believe it or not, to even the ball out so it would move funny. Several other, they put paraffin on the ball. Eddie Cicotti, one of the Black Sox, was a great pitcher in the teens, and he was he put paraffin on the ball, wax to smooth it out, and that would give a baseball an erratic movement, like a spitball or knuckleball. They did all kinds of things. Walter was a stickler for a clean ball, and the reason was because he threw so hard, and he had great control. I mean, the catchers, all of his catchers said the same thing, which is that they put the glove up and they knew that's where the ball was going to be most of the time. He could be wild. Walter could be wild on occasion, and it may be because the opposite pitcher was messing with the ball. But they talked about how other pitchers love to have a dirty ball, a messed up ball, and Walter didn't. He was always throwing the ball in for a new ball, and they mentioned it, and that got mentioned in game articles. That Johnson would, the umpire would throw out a ball, and Johnson would throw that one back, and he'd say, "No, that's not good enough. Get me a cleaner one." He wanted a clean ball, and that was an unusual feature of Walter's pitching back in the time, because pitchers just loved to have a ball that was messed up, most of them.
And let me ask you this question. Walter Johnson, of course, was born in Allen County, Kansas, and he was the second of 6 children. From your great-grandfather owned a 160-acre farmland, which Walter and his siblings, your aunts and uncles, and they all had to go, and they had to till the soil, and it was very difficult. And until they moved to California at a later time, baseball wasn't even part of his growing up. Hunting and fishing, I think, were, which later became his passion, if I'm not mistaken, reading your book. But the thing is, how did he get involved in baseball, and was his humble upbringing in abject poverty and working hard gave him the kind of character on and off the field?
I think there's no question about the truth of all of that. It wasn't abject poverty. It was just farm life, and back then, they were. This was a homestead farm to settle the West. They gave away. The government gave away. This is what you're talking about, the 1870s, the 1880s. They would give away these 160-acre plots and you had to work them. You had to farm them but it was free land, and that's what his father did. And he describes it as a pretty idyllic life. I mean, he loved it, and they were a few miles outside of a small town, and they would go into town, I don't know how often, a couple times a month maybe, and I guess they would sell excess produce or livestock or whatever to get money to buy clothes and that kind of thing. I mean, it was but they had there's a picture of the house that his father built, and it's a pretty nice looking house. So you figure, well, there was a lot of people living there, but he was one of 6 kids, and this was not like a Depression era ramshackle, and they were right on a river. It was it's very good land. I've been there, and it's still farmed today, and it's very productive. All these 150 years later. So. As you say, Walter fished. They were right on the river. He fished. He hunted. He loved to hunt, and those were just the great loves of his life. In terms of, he just there was nothing he liked better than to get out with some hunting dogs and go after raccoons, and he did that in Germantown. And fishing not so much, but hunting, he was outdoors, and there's no question that helped. And he's working. He doesn't remember what time when he wasn't working. Obviously, when you're on a farm like that, you need all hands to help. And so whatever a 5-year-old kid can do, Walter was doing, and that he grew up big and strong. And the other side of it about his personality, I think that also contributed in that I've always thought, Walter, imagine his father. I mean, you're out there on this isolated farm. His father and his mother had to know how to do everything. Everything. You got this piece of land, and okay, here's this piece of land. It's got nothing on it. And you build a life that's good enough to support yourself and 6 children, and to bring them up happy and healthy and strong. And imagine what Walter thought, especially of his father. I mean, he just must have been in awe of somebody, and tremendous. And his father was a wonderful man, also, by all accounts. Just had a great personality. And aside from being just somebody, I mean, I don't think he had much education at all, and I don't think his mother was well educated. But gosh, I mean, just imagine being able to do that. And so I think that might have been part of it. That God, Walter, when anybody would praise, all he ever did was he just was born with this long arm. And the ability somehow, the coordination, the innate coordination to throw it very hard. And that made him a big star and made him a lot of money and all that kind of thing. But I doubt if Walter, compared to what his father did, I doubt if Walter ever thought anything he ever did was that great or outstanding. So, now, you're right about, and also he never played baseball. There was no baseball. They were out there isolated. And let's see, when Walter was 14, they got driven off the farm by a drought, and that couldn't have been a lot of fun. And was probably some abject poverty there for a little while. Everything dried up. It was a heat wave, and so they moved into town, and now Walter was playing catch out in the streets. He had a buddy that had a catcher's glove, but it was just that's all it was. There weren't enough kids to have any kind of organized. There was no little leagues at the time. Then they moved. Walter's uncle, one of his father's brothers, got a job, everybody's bailing out of Kansas because of this drought, this heat wave. So one of his uncles went to Southern California, went to the Los Angeles area, because oil had been discovered there. This is 1901. Oil had been discovered. Cars have been invented, and they're coming along, and oil's being used for other things. Before that, it was all whale oil. So he got a job and wrote to his brother, Walter's father, that, oh my gosh, they're hiring like crazy here, and they're paying good wages and all like that. So the family moved lock, stock, and barrel to Southern California, outside of Los Angeles, to the oil fields. And his father took a job with the Santa Fe Oil Company, one of the big producers at that time. And they had a whole new life, and part of the whole new life was their baseball was a hot thing there among kids and adults, and of course the weather was conducive to playing year-round. So that's really when Walter got started. And he started with kids' teams, and then when he was 16, he got kind of discovered. One of the adults that was playing in these semi-pro leagues spotted Walter pitching in a kids' game, and at the age of 16, Walter started playing semi-pro baseball, and he was pitching at the age of 16 against major, mostly minor league players, but also some major leaguers that would go to that area over the winter to keep playing and to make some money doing it. And they played in these semi-pro leagues, and they were the ringers, and the teams were filled out by local guys. And that's how Walter got started. And from the age of 16, he was pitching against some really good players and good competition. And he was great from the start. Walter was great from the start. there was no development time in Walter's career other than maybe that year or two in playing in kids leagues where, you know, his first real exposure to team baseball. But as soon as he started pitching against really good talent, you know, he was up to it. It was just a natural talent with him. There was never any learning curve for him, but that's how he got started.
And let me ask you this. One of the things that blew me away reading in your book, and I want you to describe a little bit of it, was the Labor Day weekend of 1908. Unbelievable about this story.
Well, I mean, it's one of the greatest achievements in pitching history. Walter was 20 years old. It was his second year. And this was in September, as you said, Labor Day. They had a 4-game series. The Nationals, as they were known then, and now, went to New York to play the Highlanders just before they started being called the Yankees. And Walter, as he always did, he was the star pitcher. Pitched the first game and shut them out gave up 6 hits. And the pitching staff at that time, there was only 17. The roster, it was 17 players on a major league team. People don't realize that. There just weren't as many players. And the Washington team, it was late in the season, and their pitching staff was just shot. So the manager, Joe Cantillion, asked Walter if he thought he could pitch again the next day. He had a pretty easy game, the first one. So Walter said, "Yeah, I think so. Arm feels good." So he shut him out again, this time on 4 hits. And let's see, the next day was a Sunday, and there was no Sunday baseball back then. You know, that was a religious holiday, and so that was wasn't long after that they started playing on Sundays, but at this time, so they had the day off. So then comes Monday, and there's a big Labor Day doubleheader. Place is going to be packed, and again, the manager, Cantillion, said to Walt, he said, "Well, you've had a day off now. How's the arm feel? You think you can pitch again today?" And Walt, he said, "Well, let me warm up and see how it feels." And he threw a few pitches, and he said, "Yeah, it feels okay. I think maybe so." So he pitched the first game of this doubleheader. Shut him out again, this time on 2 hits. He's getting better over time. So then the funny part about the story, which is absolutely true, is that Walter went and hid in the locker room. He hid behind some lockers, afraid that the manager was going to ask him to pitch the second game of the doubleheader. And Walter said, you know, he figured he'd done enough. But anyway, so he pitched 3 shutouts in 4 days over a 4-day span and got better. 6 hits, 4 hits, then 2 hits. And but he had that was the outstanding example. But there's many other examples of Walter's durability. I mean, pitching just didn't seem to really take anything out of his arm. He had this easy. You can see the film on YouTube. He just swung his arm, and he always wondered why other pitchers didn't pitch that way, because you can see that there's just so much less strain on the arm than the kind of wrenching overhead motion that most pitchers use. So, but he pitched an 18-inning shutout one time. It's the longest shutout's ever been pitched. I mean, that's 2 games, 18 innings. And there's other documented. There was a period when he just got used in relief. I mean, you look at his record, and he'd pitch a full game, and then he'd pitch the next 2 days in relief, the next 2 games, and then pitch his regular game. I mean, they used him an enormous amount, and his arm withstood it. mostly, I guess, because of this easy motion and that he was just a big, strong guy. But that's the outstanding, example of his durability was 3 shutouts in 4 days. Imagine that.
That would never happen in today's baseball with pitching counts and stuff like. God knows how much pitching counts he had to go through. 150.
Yeah, they wouldn't have. They'd have, and with a jewel like Johnson on the staff, I mean, they'd have protected him. They'd have done everything, just like they look after Strasburg. They'd have done everything they could to try to keep his career going. No, that never would have happened. It didn't happen back then. I mean, it was unusual back then. Pitchers pitched a lot more back then, and they were expected to finish their games. But and there was, Iron Man McGinnity with the New York Giants pitched a couple of doubleheaders in his career. So pitchers did do some unusual things, but nothing like that.
And let me ask you something. I think it was Grantland Rice, the famous sports writer, who coined the nickname of your grandfather, the Big Train. Am I right with that?
No, actually, I disproved that. That took me weeks to pin that down, and I finally did. And but that was very commonly written for a long time. That up until my book, that Grantland Rice had come up with the Big Train, and it was an example of people conflating. Rice came up with a lot of classic epithets. He coined the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and there were some others, and he was a very colorful writer during Walter's time and afterwards. So I think people just kind of assumed that it must have been Rice that came up with that. And I was always suspicious about that because of a very long article that Rice wrote about Walter in, I think it was 1928. It was pretty much contemporaneously, right after his career or toward the end of it, a very long piece where he calls him everything but the Big Train. He called him the Kansas Cyclone, which was used sometimes, maybe the Weiser Wonder. He pitched semi-pro ball in Weiser, Idaho, and people would, early on, the Weiser Wonder. Rice, and he never used the Big Train, and I thought, well, boy, that's curious. Here's the guy that's supposed to have come up with the Big Train, and he doesn't call him that once in this article. So I was always skeptical, and I actually spent several weeks at the Library of Congress going trying to find out. I mean, I worked back to where's he being called the Big Train? And then I worked back to try to find where it started. And I really never expected to find it, but I wanted to try because I didn't think that Grantland Rice came up with it. And I actually found it. I mean, it was just kind of miraculous that I did, and it had to do with probably the worst thing Walter ever did in his life, which was Walter jumped to the Federal League in 1914, in the off season of 1914, and in doing so, he reneged on a contract he had with Washington. And the reason he did it is kind of a funny story. Walter had just come off of maybe the greatest 3 years any pitcher has ever put together, 1911, 12, and 13. And 12 and 13, he won more than 30 games in each of those seasons. Well, then in 1914, and he had a 3-year contract at like $7,000 a year or something. So here comes 1914, and the Senators offered him a $500 raise. So 1914 was the end of the contract, and so now he's up for a new contract, and they offered him a new contract at an additional $500 a year. And and the reason that they cited was that 1914 hadn't been a very good year for him because he only won 28 games, down from 36 the year before. And Walter didn't like that. Walter was pretty unhappy about that. And at the same time, the Federal League was getting underway, and they were offering big contracts, and he got offered $20,000 a year. A 3-year contract at $20,000 a year by the Chicago Whales. Joe Tinker was the manager, offered him that contract, and Walter took it. And in doing so, he actually reneged on the contract he had signed with Washington. And as it turned out, Clark Griffith went to Kansas and talked Walter into, shamed Walter into re-signing with Washington. But at spring training 1915, nobody knew who Johnson was going to play for that year because he had signed this contract with Chicago, and then he says, no, I'm not going to honor that contract. I'm going to stick with my original contract with Washington. But nobody really knew for sure. And so in the Washington Post, a writer named Stanley Milliken with the Washington Post wrote an article about how everyone was looking forward to Johnson was supposed to arrive on the train, and everybody was looking forward to it because they really weren't sure who he was going to play with. And so the train, Walter didn't make that particular train, and everybody's like, oh my God, maybe he's going to Chicago instead. Here the train pulls in, and so Milliken wrote. Here's what this is a weird thing. He wrote. The big train that was supposed to carry Walter Johnson into training camp arrived today and without Johnson on it, and that fueled speculation and blah, blah, blah. And the very next day, the train comes in, and there's Johnson. And Milliken, I don't know how this happened in his mind. He just thought that phrase, the big train, and he used it about Johnson. And he said, Walter Johnson, the big train of the Washington pitching staff, showed up today to everybody's relief and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And then in the days following, Milliken started using it as an epithet for Johnson, the big train. And I was pretty proud of myself for digging that out and actually, tracing all the way back to the source of that very famous nickname. And it turned out it was not Grantland Rice, as I suspected all along.
You see, it also shows the listeners at home the kind of deep research you did, and not just take things on face value, and you did your fact checking, which is very much kudos.
Yeah, you had to be a little obsessed. No other writer would have gone. You don't have the time. You got to get this thing done. But to me, and also, as I said, it was just for a long time the research was just a hobby. This was fun for me to have a free day and go down. Of course, I had the Library of Congress at my disposal. Oh my gosh, talk about a resource. And people don't know this, but the WPA, one of Roosevelt's Depression-era job creating strategies was the WPA, and they made it a project for the WPA to microfilm all of the small town newspapers all around the country. And those microfilms are at the Library of Congress. And so and every small town had a newspaper, even places like Humboldt, Kansas, and Weiser, Idaho, and these little towns in Southern California that he pitched for the semi-pro teams there. They all had newspapers, and the Sunday ball games in those towns were the biggest events of the week, and they got great coverage. And so I was able to come up with all kinds of stuff about Walter's early days that nobody had ever documented before, just by having the Library of Congress at my disposal and having access to all these WPA microfilms. It was just wonderful. So I mean, that was, still to this day, I said, like, Walter liked hunting. I loved when I had a free day and I could go down, especially when they were open late, open till 9 o'clock, which they were like 3 days a week, Library of Congress. I mean, I'd be in that dark room with the microfilm for 12, 14 hours sometimes going through that stuff. I loved it. And so but it was special to me. No other, a professional writer just wouldn't have had the ability to do that.
That's fantastic. Now, let me ask you this. Your grandmother, Hazel, we know they got married in 1914. I think it was 16 years. They had 6 kids. One of them who passed on, I think, in 1921, Eleanor, died from influenza in December. I know she died tragically, Hazel, in 1930. What profound effect did it have on Walter?
Well, about as profound as it could be, and as you could imagine, they really they were a love match. When they found each other, that was it. And you can see it in the pictures and everything that people wrote about them. It really was kind of a mismatch. She was this beautiful debutante about town. She was her father was the congressman from Nevada, and he was kind of a famous guy in his own right. E. Roberts was his name. He was the congressman for many years, and then he became the mayor of Reno. And he is largely responsible for the libertarian laws that persist to this day in Nevada. That's a whole other side story that I got to write about, because this guy became Walter Johnson's father-in-law of all things. But anyway. They were staying at what they called apartment hotels, people with money back in the day. It was sort of, they were hotels that people had apartments in. I mean, rich people in New York, had apartments in the Waldorf Astoria and other places. And that's what they did back then. And the ball players that were making, I mean, Walter always made, really good money for the time. And so he was staying there too. The ball players that were making the good money, and they met in the dining room, introduced by Clyde Milan, a ball player with Washington who was Walter's best friend, and it was just love at first sight. And I don't think that love ever diminished, an iota during their time together. But kind of a mismatch, a 19-year-old debutante, and here you got this kind of rough-hewn farmer's son, ball player Walter Johnson. But she was beautiful, and Walter was handsome as he could be, big, strong, handsome guy, and famous. Really the toast of Washington at the time. So, I mean, it was a real match, and they had a wonderful life. They really did. And then she died. Terrible story. She died in the heat wave that kicked off the Dust Bowl of all things. She drove. It was during the season, and Walter was managing Washington at the time. He was away on a long road trip, and she decided to drive the family out to Kansas to visit Walter's mom and other relatives and spend some time there and probably get away from the heat of Washington, ironically. And while they were out there, this heat wave hit. And it was, I traced, she actually met Walter and had dinner with Walter and Clark Griffith on the way back in St. Louis. It was 116 degrees. And, of course, there was no air conditioning in the car. Mom remembers the trip and how miserable it was, and the kids were sick, and it was hot, and she got heat stroke and died made it back to Washington, but then died of heat exhaustion. And that was just devastating, of course, to him, and he was never the same. I actually asked Shirley Povich that question of if he could tell a difference, a change in Walter, and Povich said, "Oh yeah, that was he was not the same person after Hazel died." And yeah, I can see it in the photos. I mean, I swear, if you show me a photo in 1930, I can tell you if it was before she died or after she died. I mean, he just, this Paul came over. He didn't. Ty Cobb, in his biography, actually said that Walter confided to Cobb that he had thought seriously about killing himself. He was so distraught.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. And but he had the kids and had 5 kids. He was also raising 2 of his sister's kids. He actually had 7 kids that he was raising, that he and Hazel were raising. 2 of his sister's husband had died, and so he was raising 2 of her kids. And so he kept going, and his mom came back from Kansas to help with the kids, but life really changed for everybody. And I remember Walter's mom very well. She lived to 100, and I was 21 years old when she died. And she had a little house on Uncle Ed's farm out in Comus, Maryland, and we used to go out and visit her all the time. I remember her very well. And I wish I'd known more about Walter to ask her some questions.
Yeah,
but,
can you imagine?
Yeah, so I never knew her. I never knew Walter. I never knew Hazel, but I knew her. I knew Walter's mom real well.
How do you like that? Now, let me ask you this. Walter's string of 20 wins was broken in 1920 because he was sick, he had a sore arm, he had leg muscles. And then the next year, tragedy struck when his father died of a stroke and his 2-year-old daughter died from influenza. But yet in 1924, we're talking 17 years, in his 18th season, he finally wins the World Series.
Yeah. Well, it's just, it's one of the great stories. I have no problem whatsoever mounting a very strong case for the 7th game of the 24 World Series as the greatest baseball game that's ever been played. That thing is something else. I did a whole chapter on it. I mean, it's amazing. But just to begin with, he got the drama of, Walter had that sore arm in 1920. It was right after he pitched his only no-hitter. And he developed this sore arm, and I'm sure a doctor could diagnose it. He talked about how this little golf ball-sized lump developed at his elbow, and he just did not have the force on the ball that he did before. And he was still now, I think he won 17 games in 21. I mean, he's still very good, but not the old, not doing the kinds of things that he had done before. And he wrote that every year that lump got a little smaller, and that all of a sudden, at the beginning of 1924, he realized the lump was gone, of all things. And now, it was his 18th year. He announced at the beginning of the season that he was going to retire. This was going to be his last year. He had some money he wanted to buy. He's looking for his future. He's got this growing family. He wanted to buy a minor league team and become a team owner and have some security for his future, for his family. So he had announced that this was going to be his last. Also, there was no reason to believe at all that the Senators were going to do anything in 24. They had they had barely finished fourth the year before in the first division. They had exactly the same team. They had not improved the team. The manager in 1924 was Bucky Harris, who was 26 years old. He was the second baseman. The only reason he was the manager was that nobody else wanted the job. Griffith offered the job to like 4 other people, and they turned it down. There had been a manager every year. Harris was the 5th manager in the last 5 years for the Senators. There was just, and here's Johnson getting older, their big star, getting older every year. He's another year older, and there was just no reason to believe that this team was going to do anything. So Walter decided, okay, well, that's enough for me. I'm going to go off, and he said, okay, this is going to be my last year. And it was a Cinderella season. It was just, they just put it together. Harris fired him up, this young guy. He was just the right guy for that job, and he was just full of fire, and of course he wanted to make his mark on the game, and all of a sudden he's the manager of the Washington team at the age of 26, and he does have Walter Johnson, and he's got some other good players. He's got Goose Goslin, he's got Sam Rice. They're both in the Hall of Fame. Fred Marbury, hard-throwing rookie, became the first great relief pitcher, ironically, relieving Walter Johnson in the late innings that year. And he just fired the team up and got him, they called him the boy wonder manager. So they actually beat the Yankees of Ruth and Gehrig and Lazzari and those other guys. The Yankees had the Senators interrupted. If it wasn't for Washington, the Yankees would have won 8 pennants in a row. But Washington came in and interrupted in 24 and 25. Ruth had some problems during that time, and Gehrig was just coming on. But still, the Yankees were great. They had won 3 pennants in a row. And Washington comes in, and Detroit, it was a great pennant race, 3-way pennant race, almost to the end, between Washington, New York, and Detroit, Cobb and Manouche and other great Heilman with Detroit. And the Senators eked it out. They won with the second to last game of the season. They clinched the pennant, and they go in the World Series. And that was the World Series was a David and Goliath story. They were up against John McGraw's greatest team, his 4th National League pennant in a row. They had a real juggernaut. That whole team, practically, the starting lineups in the Hall of Fame, almost every one of them. Didn't have a lot of pitching, but that starting lineup was formidable. And it was just a great World Series. And ironically, Walter lost his first 2 games in the series. And everybody figures he's done. They played a game every day for 7 days in a row, no breaks. They would take the train back and forth between New York and Washington. And so the pitching staff was shot. Johnson was done. He actually got bombed up at the Polo Grounds in the 5th game. So the Senators are down 3-2. Everybody figures, well, they're done. And, they don't have Johnson to pitch anymore. And they have to win 2 games in a row and stuff. And Tom Zachary pitched a great game in the 6th game and evened the series. And now they're coming back to D.C. on this beautiful fall afternoon. And anybody in D.C. that was anybody, and from the president on down, anybody that could get a ticket to that game came out. And it was one of the great days in the history of baseball. Certainly the greatest day in the history of Washington baseball, and without a doubt the greatest day in Walter Johnson's career. As you know, he came in unexpectedly. The game was tied going into the 9th inning, and Bucky Harris is completely out of pitchers. The pitching staff is just all used up, completely shot. But he's got Walter Johnson sitting on the bench. So, greatest pitcher ever. Brought him in, and Johnson held the Giants. Very dramatic 4 innings, men on base every inning. Walters struck out the Major League RBI leader, Long George Kelly, the Giants' first baseman, had driven in 138 runs to lead the major leagues that year. Struck him out twice with 2 men on base each time. I mean, the drama of those 4 innings, of Walter's 4 innings, is just, you couldn't make it up. Nobody would believe it. And then finally in the 12th inning, other circumstances intervened. Muddy Rule popped one up behind the plate. The catcher stumbled on his mask and tripped and dropped the ball. So Rule got a hit, his first hit in the series, by the way. And then Earl McNeely hits a ball, a sharp hit down the third base line. It was just going to be a double play for sure. And he hit something, they call it the pebble hit. It hit something and bounded completely over the third baseman's head, Freddie Lindstrom's head, and rolled out into left field. And Rule, who was probably the slowest runner on the whole team, chugging around the bases and made it in to score, and the Senators won the World Series. To this day, the only World Series they've ever. I'm looking for number 2 this year. How about you, Ian?
Well, they got the best record in the league right now, Washington.
Oh man, and they're a juggernaut. They're a juggernaut.
They are. I mean, and when
they got to do it this year, they really do.
Well, you know something? If the Yankees keep playing the way they do, they might meet.
Wouldn't that be something? Yeah, that'd be great. Oh, what a series that would be! I just want them to get there. They got to get out of that first round of the playoffs.
That's the sad part, because they have had the best team probably in the last 3 years. The pitching stats, it's second to none when you think they got Max Scherzer and.
They got everything this year. They got everything. They got the hitting. They got the pitching. They got the defense. I'm really thinking that this could be the year. We'll see. As they say, that's why they play the games. Yeah.
That's right. But last thing I want to say, you know what fascinated me also. I'm going to end with this, and then. I'll ask you where we can find the book and, if I left anything else. One of the things that fascinated me, you got in your appendix the top 15 games that, that Walter pitched. And again, there's so many later dates, 26. Was the first one. I think it was in April of 26, and then you have 27, the year that he, retired, and you have the World Series of 24. I was amazed to see just the longevity of your grandfather, and how in today's game, how it would be so unfathomable to almost be the same pitcher, you were almost 20 years before.
Yeah, he was too. He's the only pitcher that's ever pitched 21 years with the same team. I think that's kind of cool. He's the only pitcher that has ever done that. Pitchers that pitch that long, but not with the same team. And he could have kept going. Griffith tried to talk him out of retiring. In 1930, the Senators were competing for the pennant. They actually beat the Yankees that year. The Yankees really. Ruth Gehrig in their prime, other great players. The Senators beat them out for second place to Athletics, that great Athletics team. But the real flaw on the team was relief pitching, and Fred Marbury had become a starter, and there was a lot of talk about Johnson coming back to pitch relief for the team, and Griffith was all for it. Johnson ended up deciding not to, just thinking that it would take him too long to get into shape, and that he was managing the team, that would be too much of to try to do all at once. But There's some fun stories about, I don't know if you remember, but the chapter following his pitching career, I have some quotes from other books, from other players, about facing Johnson. He used to pitch batting practice when he was a manager for Washington and Cleveland, and there's some fun anecdotes about great players getting in of a later time. I think Babe Herman was one. Hank Greenberg actually had a tryout with the Senators in 1930 and faced Walter Johnson of all things, and he wrote in his autobiography about that experience. And players were always saying, "How come you're retired?" And this went on into 1939. Walter was the broadcaster of all things, and there's actually a tape of a game that people can get on the internet and listen to. Walter was he wasn't bad. He kind of folksy in a Will Rogers kind of way. So he went down to spring training to just scout out the team. He'd been a farmer for years and became the broadcaster. So he went down to spring training just to familiarize himself with the players and the team. And he was warming up. There was this Cuban rookie, Roberto Ortiz, that the Senators had, that people were calling, he's the next Walter Johnson. He throws, this fastball. And so Ortiz was warming up on the sideline, and Walter was just watching from the stands. And Walter gets up and goes and talks to the Washington catcher, Jake Early, and they start playing catch. And the next thing, and Ortiz talked about this, the next thing they know, Walter's throwing harder than Ortiz. And Ortiz just stops throwing, and he turns to Walter, and he says, "Why you retired?" in this Cuban accent. He says, "Why are you retired?" He couldn't understand it. At this point, Walter was like 52 years old. So there's some great stories about, they say a lot of pitchers, it's not the arm that goes, it's the legs. They say the legs can't take it anymore. But, Feller was throwing out opening pitches well into his 80s. He was almost 90 years old and stuff. So anyway, I love those stories, though. So Walter, he was. And if it hadn't been for that broken leg in spring training in 27, the writers were just, wowing about how great Johnson looked and just what a great season he looked primed for, his 21st year with the Senators. And then a line drive broke his leg in spring training, and he never really he had some good games during the year, but it took him a long time to recover, and he just decided that was enough.
And let me ask you this. In the 22 years since the publication of this book, have you stumbled upon anything new that you could add to like another 50 to 100 pages to the book in parts that maybe you didn't come up with in the mid-90s?
No, not really. Little tidbits here and there. I've made a few notes that if I ever do another edition, there have been 3 editions of the book. It's been in paperback for almost 20 years. That if I do another edition, which I have it in mind to do, but nothing major, nothing that I would devote. These are just little details that I thought would be interesting enough maybe to throw in another edition of the book if I ever do that. But I as they say, I didn't leave anything on the field in this one. I did my research the first time, and so no, I'd have to say no. I'm going to talk. I want to talk to Mark Lerner at some point this year about that. I'd love to do a last edition of the book, a ballpark only edition. Sell the book at Nationals Park, maybe in the game store. I have it in mind to talk to Mark about that at some point. I need to give him a call.
You know what?
And I would actually, if I did another edition, I would actually cut it down a little bit. I'd cut out some of the statistical stuff and, maybe make it a little more reader friendly. When I did the book, SABR, the Society for American Baseball Research, was really in its heyday, and I did the book with two audiences in mind, a general reader, but then also the SABR guys who really knew their baseball. I wanted it to be acceptable to them too. So there's quite a bit of numbers and details in there that I think I might hone down a little bit if I do this ballpark edition of the book.
Well, you certainly have written a heck of a book. Everyone at home listening to this, go out, go buy it. Now, let me ask you this question. Did I miss anything that maybe you would like to tell the folks at home that maybe something I didn't touch upon, that maybe you think it's important?
Well, gosh, there's so much, Ian. How we've gone on at great length, and there's there's many things we could talk about at great length about his. It was just such an outstanding career and life, and I would just say to people, if you want to know more, get on Amazon and get a copy of the book. It's all in there, and as you say, people have said it reads pretty well. So, maybe we'll talk another time and touch on some other subjects. Oh my gosh, there's so many aspects. His getting started with Washington, how he ended up coming to Washington, and his experience as a rookie in Washington, and there's so much. The guy, we haven't even talked about the guys he pitched against, like Cobb and Ruth and some of the other great pitchers of the time, and there is so much, just so much, but only so many hours in the day.
Yeah, and somebody said,
hopefully we'll have another chance.
Oh, we will, because I'll tell you what, I promised you an hour. I think we're an hour and 24 minutes into it. So
yeah, and I said, what did I tell you? I thought that was a little too long, but boy, get me started. And
well, I do that kind of questioning that makes the office think, and you could see that I do cross-examine. But I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to send you another email. We'll get you back on the show. I know you're also you produce and edit The Glory of Their Times. We'll talk some dead ball baseball. We'll talk about stuff maybe we haven't touched upon on Walter Johnson on the show. And we'll make it another hour and a half. How does that sound?
Sounds wonderful, Ian. I really enjoyed this.
I am glad you did, because it was a complete honor on my part to have you on the show to share.
You did. It was a great interview. I've done a lot of them, and they're not. They don't all go as well as this. So congratulations to you too.
Well, I appreciate it. Hold the line. This is how I end the show, folks. As you see, history is very important. Walter Johnson, and let me know if I'm incorrect on this, Henry. He's overlooked, and I think he's overlooked because of his nice guy persona. How could you make a movie on Walter and not have any, bad things? I could make a movie on Walter and just give all his greatness in the film. It's pretty much a baseball story, not anything seedy. But
yeah, I actually have, believe it or not, I have a script. But you're right, and the drama is you have to end the movie at the 1924 World Series, and the drama is about that season and about this great pitcher He's never going to be in a World Series because he stayed loyal to these bad teams all his career and blah, blah, blah. And then the team finally puts it together, and now you're in the World Series. That World Series has plenty of drama for a movie. But, yeah, I mean, it's, you're not, you just don't have any wild side or anything like that. So, it can be a problem. I don't think it's a problem for the book. There's plenty of interest, plenty of interest to go around in the book.
Yeah. And, this is like I said in the beginning of the show. People have commented that this is one book that should be on your bookshelf. You autographed this book for me. It's hardcover. I keep it on my shelf. I had to take it off and reread part of this stuff just so I can understand and refresh myself what to talk about today. But folks, go out, go buy the book. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. Thank you very much, Hank Thomas, for coming on the show, talking about his grandfather, Walter Johnson, and in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.